Hi there, my name is Liam Bishop and this is the second episode of my Interviews with Writers series. Today I'm excited to be talking to Thomas Chadwick. His debut collection of short stories, Above the Fat, were published by Splice. He's also an editor of Partisan Hotel magazine, and before we chatted, he read a passage from Birch, a story in Above the Fat.
Business boomed. Optimism was shooting up everywhere and bursting into flower. Music was jocular. Sport was effusive. Soon it would be possible to do the most wonderful things with computers. People woke and felt buoyant. Cereal was measured out with glee. Steam lifted from the mugs of recently reconciled marriages. Parents treated children to extravagant lunchbox items. People would turn to their loved ones and say things like, "I can't wait to read the paper," and "What a time to be alive." But the people had been called out before. They knew from history books and the Bible and Panorama that no flower can last forever. They knew that after summer the petals fold and fail, the leaves wither, the plant dies. The people knew that in good times smart people put down roots, so the people built houses. People were building a whole lot of houses. To build houses you need timber, and because Stuart's business traded solely in timber, the optimism soon wormed its way into the wood at Ford's mill. Orders were rampant. Builders bought 4x2 by the pack and skirting board by the bundle. Stuart sent his lorries out full every morning and watched them return empty by lunch. Often they would be sent out again because of all the optimism about all the houses. Because business was booming and everyone was having such a great time, because it was all so serenely upbeat. Education, 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 New Labour said. Smart people build houses. Stuart was smart. Too smart to sell timber for a living, people said. Far too smart. Could have been a lawyer, they said. Could have been a damn fine lawyer. A teacher at Stuart's school, Mr. Charters, was certain that Stuart had it in him to be a damn fine lawyer. "You should go to university," he told Stuart. "Study law. Dad wants me to join the family business." "What business is that?" "The timber business."
So you've just read from Birch. This is a story about a man, Stuart, who's taken over his father's business selling timber in the boom years of 1997. And I was just wondering, what is the significance of all this Birch? What's the significance of all this material?
I'd been thinking about writing a story about Birch for a very long time. I guess the origin of that story is actually I worked in a timber merchant for a couple of years, for a year when I was younger. And I was told this story by a guy who worked there about how, and he said it very clearly. He basically told me in 5 minutes how the price of timber plummeted in the late 90s because of the internet. I was really quite interested in ways in which things that seem quite abstract, ephemeral, the internet's a good example of that, built on material things and then have material effects. So I had this idea for a story that basically involved that taking that idea of the collapse of timber prices because of the boom in the internet, which is tied directly to the fact that when the internet took off, there was more printing because people wanted to print their emails, and that led to more paper. As it was explained to me, it kind of reversed the way that paper was normally made. So normally you make paper from the byproduct of a timber. When you chop down a tree for timber, you turn it to timber, and everything that's left over, you turn into paper. But because they needed so much paper, they cut down more trees and just used the byproduct bit, and were left with all this timber, which more timber was then available, which meant the price went down. Anyway, so that's how I was told this story, probably in like 2000, I want to say 2006. When I came to write about it, I actually tried to look for actual evidence of this story and found none. I couldn't find any evidence anywhere. There's nothing in the internet that I could find about how internet and the paper trade destroyed timber prices in the late 90s. So that but by that point I was kind of already thinking about it as enough as a story that I wanted to pursue it. Then for a long time, all it existed as was I had this, basically the vision that you end the story with, which is a man, or the main character, surrounded by birch trees because this is his solution to the problem that he's encountered. He's decided to, I guess, circumvent the problem that's facing him and actually just go and say, right, well, if I just a byproduct, maybe I can just grow that byproduct, and that will how I solve that problem. Which is also how I was originally told by my friend at the timber merchant how the problem was solved back in the late 90s, even though I couldn't find evidence.
There's no hard evidence of this ephemeral on the thing.
I could look again. I got to a certain point looking when I just thought, well, you're writing a fictional story. Do you need to keep looking? And I'd already by this point gone quite deep into the writing of it anyway. So for a long time, I just sat around like that. And eventually, I think probably about I think it would have written in about 2015. I actually sat down and built a story around it and kind of produced the story that is now in the collection.
The first story of the collection, in a story called A Train Passes Through the Ruhr region in the Early Morning. What this appears to be is a series of glimpses, as a person presumably seeing as they sit on the train things passing by in the window. One of the things I noticed, though, in what you write, is there's so much Birch, it's untrue. Well, it appears to have come true in Birch.
But I've definitely been thinking about it, been on my mind for quite a long time. So when I think I just had in my head it was something that had kind of followed me for a long time. The presence of these birch trees that had kind of merged. And I guess that reflects back onto something that I think the story, or at least I was trying to do with the story more generally, which is, as I said, trying to look for ways that these abstract things are made material. And a lot of the things in that little vignette are quite material. I mean, it's, they're these quite physical things. And I just basically put this out because I thought it would kind of introduce some of those ideas that I was trying to deal with, definitely in the Birch story.
There's a few things in that I think are really interesting. I think you talk about this idea of byproducts, and it's a word that you use in Birch, and it's a word that you just said then. And Stuart visits Sweden, doesn't he? And he goes to the factory of where his timber has been sourced from, or he goes to the place where all this birch is coming from, which is in Sweden. But what he does when he's out there, he meets a man called Dietmar, who is a paper salesman, who's on the same trip as he is. But paper is not Stuart's concern, and he says it's ultimately a byproduct of the wood that he buys. And what I noticed that you write about in Birch, and what you alluded to there, is people printing off emails and people printing off lots of things. And paper seems to be waste product, and you call it pulp, which it is, but it's an idea for Stuart that relates to an idea of waste, I think. And there's images of him, he gets this printer himself, and it spews out orders constantly. Bits of paper drop off from it, and they're all over the floor. It jams up a lot with all the sheets. And I was wondering then if there's a question here of what goes into your writing process, or what went into writing that story. I was wondering what were the byproducts of this story, maybe.
In a way, I think a lot of, and I guess this is one of the sort of slight cliches of writing, which is you start trying to do one thing and end up doing other things. But certainly my experience of writing that story was to try and produce like one product of a story and actually end up producing a byproduct that was, that actually became the finished story. Because I think it actually became a story about, I guess almost about someone's aspirations, but kind of the failure of those aspirations, I think. And some of that was more conscious, I think. I deliberately said it in 97. That was a very conscious choice to think about Born of New Labour. But it was written in 2010, so it was written after the financial crisis. So I guess you can say it was written at the bookend of that period of history.
So you chose to put it in 1997.
Yeah, no, that was my decision. I think it wasn't, and I think, I remember thinking quite consciously about that. I think basically that vantage point gives the story a sort of pathos, because even if that mill hadn't collapsed then, there's the sense that these things might have booming, and the optimism that starts in the story will 15 years later have receded and will be in a very different place. I think that one of the reviews of the collection, which put it in, which again is a nice byproduct because you find things out that you didn't know, but basically said that kind of set up the project for the rest of the book, which I've never really thought about before. But I think when I read that, it definitely for me did, in the sense that created the space in which actually a lot of these characters who are all normally quite like thwarted and slightly despondent, and things haven't quite worked out the way they wanted, but not necessarily always in a bad way. Although I think for me, Stuart became quite obsessed with the birch that he grew and actually formed a relationship partly with that. And his solution at the end is not to seek comfort in any money he might have taken from the mill, but to go and sort of, disappear into his birch plantation, which isn't a very realistic ending at that point. But I think that was perhaps what I was looking for. And I was perhaps looking for those slightly like irrational choices that people make around like businesses or bits of their lives that seem to be made quite rationally. I think that was the thing that I was least expecting that came out of writing that story.
So you write in a style that when I was reading Birch and when I was reading your stories, and you talk about thwarted potential and these characters who have this sense of thwartedness, and you chose to write the story in a time of boom, and a word you use quite a lot is boom. I'm just going to read a little extract. In an email to Emma, he sketched out his plan. This is Stuart. He could fit several hundred trees into the acreage, and in England, where the growing season was longer, they could be ready in just 8 years' time. Dear Emma, he wrote, I'm getting into the birch game. And it's the measurements you write there, they sketched out, the very unspecific measurements, but the measurements, and they're trying to create this sense of space, but it's got limits to it. He says about fitting several hundred trees, and it's that adverb just. And there always seems to be a sense of potential in your characters, and a sense of potential in, particularly in Stuart, that never gets fulfilled. And the image of everything seeming full. And this idea of booming relates to a sense of expansion, but also relates to a sense of implosion. And I wonder if that was with you when you were writing. I wonder if that's why you chose to put it back in 1997 when you were writing it in the, when austerity was kicking in.
I think the hardest thing I found with writing that story was actually to, if you like, compress what is probably more than a short story's worth of narrative into 5,000 words.
We jump through the years as well, don't you?
3 years of narrative. I think a lot of the other pieces in the collection tend to take a kind of very small moment and zero in on it, whereas that one was definitely the most expansive and probably trying to be a novel, I think, or trying to be something much longer. But it did mean that I felt like I really had to have a tone or style for the narrative that was very clipped. I spent a lot of time trying to find the right tone for things. And I think that's probably what I spent the longest time trying to do with that story, was trying to find something that kind of had that, I think, this kind of quite compressed, but still have quite a weight and expanse to it that allowed me to kind of rattle through a lot of exposition, really, in terms of telling quite a complicated story in quite a short amount of time, and then give space to actually have a character who would give people a reason to read that story. So I needed to find space to have that personal narrative within there, and I think I could only achieve that by kind of compressing down and kind of blunting. But it's interesting that you picked up on the word boom, and I actually was thinking about that, and in its literal sense, explosion, which is, explosions aren't things we look for in life. Oh, great, there was another explosion. That's great news, guys. Yet I feel like in current sort of economic discussions, boom is like this totally okay thing. So it's very great. We've got a boom. Brilliant. Yeah, it's quite an incongruous, not even double meaning, because and as you said, an explosion always suggests there's going to be some kind of implosion, and you have a fallout. I don't need to hammer home the politics of the last 20 years, but I think, and that isn't really what the story is necessarily I was trying to do with the story. But yeah, when I was writing the story, the tone that I was looking for came together when I had that first sentence, business boom. And that was, from that point on, I had the tone and the rhythm, and it allowed me to write the rest of the story. So it was when I got to that kind of, explosion, that I was able to actually start to put my narrative together.
Well, the tone, I don't want to reduce it to kind of a metaphysical commentary on what the story is, because it's definitely not that all, and you achieve this incredibly real, for want of a better word, narrative. But the tone and the style really helps that, I think. And it does create a sort of paradoxical sense of clip. But it creates a sense of space is expanded, booming perhaps, but then it closes up. And I was wondering, as we sort of move into some of the other stories, you seem to have an interest in industry and materials in the sense of a physical, discernible products, which are either part of or the result of a manufacturing process. And this lends itself to the language that you use as you were sort of writing these stories. You seem to have an interest in these people that are part of these sort of industrial processes. In the second story, for instance, we have a man called Simon who is a window cleaner, and his scaffolding and platform has fallen from beneath him as he cleans the windows of a skyscraper, and he's stood on the 79th floor, and he's clinging on to the cracks, he's clinging on to the edge. And I wonder, much like Stuart and much like Stan and Paul, who we're going to talk about in some of the other stories, does this tie into the sense of a person or a type of person that you're trying to write about that are in some way invisible or not seen, and you have a particular desire to make visible?
I think what a lot of these stories are trying to do is I'm very interested in the way these abstract material. And I think the thing I didn't say then, which you kindly brought up now, is that the way that you make those material things visible is to actually make them visible to people that are affected by them. Birch, for instance, it's Stuart, it's the people, but also the people around him in the mill that work there. I think a key image for me, and you'd mentioned it already, was the paper churning out of the printer. But I think when I was thinking a lot about that the ideas that were in that story, that the idea that something is interconnected and global as the internet could have effects on tiny little timber merchants in rural Britain, and direct effects, not like indirect ones, not like, oh, everyone's stopped buying timber now, but actual kind of physical effects are really important. And I think the glass story, it's a similar thing. It's, although perhaps not as expansive. And I think I wrote that story when I living somewhere where they were building the Shard in London, and I used to see it all the time when I was cycling around. I remember going past the Tower of London once, and this isn't to say that, we should just preserve all our ancient castles and not be able to see anything, but the Tower of London is kind of surrounded by all these glass buildings. And part of the thing I was trying to do in that story was kind of deal with the fact that like there will be people that there are people involved in that building. There are people that it isn't just a shard of, it's just not just a part of your skyline, it's actually part of someone's day.
I don't know if you meant that or not, but people are parts of these processes, and shard is something that's abstracted and broken off from something.
I think I normally start with a subject or normally an instance, like a moment. Yeah, you need a character to take you through that. So I think it's not, for me, maybe it's thinking more about just making visible the processes that are taking place through the character. But I think that inevitably does mean that you develop a character.
You talk about the process, and you talk about these people being part of these processes and writing about the people that are involved in these processes. And there's a certain idea of logic in And the Cold Glass in particular, and that gets quite a literal rendering as Simon's hanging up there. And when he's suddenly joined by another person, a rather jolly person, which is quite at odds with the situation, it would seem. And what these two people do is they start telling jokes, or the other person starts telling jokes, or a joke, and he starts building this idea around a joke, and the joke becomes quite important to the story. I don't say why to kind of give anything away, but why did you choose to start building this story around this discussion of jokes, or was it the other way around?
I don't know which way around it occurred, but I think what's interesting about, I guess, jokes in general, but definitely the joke in that context, is whether or not a joke is funny does to an extent depend upon context. And arguably, the joke isn't that funny because of the context.
It's like, he's very jolly as his character, isn't he? But it adds to kind of the terror of the situation that he's in. And I wonder if it's this idea of a certain sense of logic that Simon is not in on, or can't grasp, or can't get access to.
I don't think, when I wrote it for a magazine that was asking for stories about time, and so I kind of constructed the scene around finding a place where time really mattered, but then actually found that it didn't really matter at all until there was someone else there to provide, I guess, a context. And maybe that, to broaden out what I said about jokes, in the sense that I think a lot of writing is about finding the context in which something matters and the context in which something is meaningful. I mean, very literally, in the sense of when you write a sentence, you can put any number of words together, but they don't really mean anything, or they don't really matter unless the context is right, or the sentences are lined up. But then also more broadly, in the sense that it's about finding the structure and the order and the context in which a narrative fits together. It's about finding I'm very obsessed with historical context, so that's, for me, I'm always thinking about that. I know I always get confused when other writers or people don't think about historical context all the time, but that's probably much more enjoyable for them. So yeah, going back to Birch again, I set that in that period. I wanted it to have that context because for me, it's what made it matter. And I think the same with some of the other stories, even if they're not necessarily so obviously set in a time, the context of what is going on is the thing that gives them the meaning.
Okay, on that, what we'll do is we'll have a short break and we'll listen to a bit more of Birch and hear some more about Stuart and his timber business. This time I must warn you that there are a couple of instances of strong language in the reading.
Everyone thought Stuart was making a huge mistake turning down the opportunity to be such a damn fine lawyer. I never even got into law school, he protested. Such a waste, they said. Stuart's loyalties were at home. That was his problem. His loyalties. He was too damn loyal by half. That spring, with optimism accumulating along rivers like froth, the foreman, Ted Coles, turned to Stuart and said he'd never seen the like. Ford's Mill was an old-fashioned merchant, which meant it moved goods. They bought timber in large volumes and sold it in smaller volumes. With the change in volume came a change in price. The change in price was the profit. Because the volumes were variable, so too was the difference in price, and so too was the profit. The more timber they bought, the cheaper their cost. The more they sold, the more money they made. It's economies of scale, Stuart's dad always said. To Stuart, it was just common sense. For years, Ford's Mill was run by Stuart's old man and his faith in economies of scale. Roughly a year after Stuart left school and started working for his dad, a competitor tried to buy them out. Representatives from Watts Timber Limited arrived in smart cars and pulled documents from a briefcase that said if Stuart's dad gave them Ford's mill, they would give him just shy of £1 million. It was a substantial offer, the member of the acquisitions team explained, for the rights to the business and assets. Stuart's dad pulled him into a wood-panelled office with the oak table and plaque for Timber Merchant of the Year Western Division 1986. "I'm retiring," he said. "This is as much your decision as mine." Stuart looked at the numbers and tried to picture what that much money would mean. "It's just a few sheds and some timber. What do they know that we don't?" His dad smiled. "That's exactly what I was thinking." A few years later, business burst into fucking flames.
There seems to be a sense then that some of these characters are stepping into or inheriting a position that's been left to them. We've seen Stuart with the family's timber factory, and then in Stan, standing more literally, a man called Stan is preparing for his brother's wedding, and he's borrowing his uncle's suit, of which there is a rip in the lining. And he stands in front of the mirror. He thinks about what his mother's going to say as he turns up to his brother's wedding. But it's just that idea of a rip in the lining and this idea of lineage. Do we always have a choice what we make out of the materials that we're given, either as a writer or just people?
I hadn't really realised there was such a central theme of some of these stories, but now that you've mentioned it, it does make a lot of sense, which is I think a lot of them are around, yeah, as you say, lineage and I guess family, for want of a better word. But yeah, I recently read Mark Fisher's Ghost of My Life, and his book is framed around the idea of hauntology, which is his definition of the persistence of the no longer in the present. One of the things he says in discussing that is that the family is quite a haunted structure. And I think that's when that line really resonated with me. And I mean, families are incredibly haunted structures by definition. You have this lineage between generations and the past and going to the future. I think it's, yeah, in terms of, if we were to return to, you mentioned Stan in his uncle's jacket, I think that's, I guess, quite a direct investigation of the weight of that lineage and the weight of that haunted structure. For me, what Stan is really struggling with in that story is partly just to get out of the room and get out of the door, but also perhaps the weight of that, the weight of time, maybe just the weight of family structure, that it's not so much the weight of his family itself, it's just the weight of what the reality of family reminds you of. And I think a wedding is a very direct kind of interaction with lineages. I mean, perhaps it's probably it's one of the more rarer moments when you do have the weight of a kind of lineage around these events where lots of people gather to watch generations pass. So I don't know if I was necessarily thinking about it so directly at the time, but I definitely, that sense of, I mean, haunting makes it sound very sinister, but I think it is the weight of time passing. And I think that necessarily leads, you can't really have time passing without some kind of sense of regret.
I think haunting is very appropriate. I think if you read these stories, I don't think you see haunting as a spooky idea. I think it is a sense of, what's passed down. And it's that rip in the lining. It's kind of like that, that rupture in time. And you talked very specifically about time. And there, in Red Sky at Night, which is towards the end of the collection, there is a wedding that a man called Paul has travelled to, but he's travelled to alone. And what's similar about these stories is that time is really important. Now, Paul doesn't want to be at this wedding. He's travelled alone. His wife is at home because she's heavily pregnant. And he's made a point about returning home, but he's going to return overland by a very complicated route. And that gets curtailed by a port authority strike. But what I noticed when you were writing that is that you sort of regiment Paul's movements. What you do is you reference the time quite a lot. And it's a digital time. It's a very specific time. And I was wondering if that idea was prevalent then when you were writing that story in The Red Sky at Night.
Yes, because I think one of the things that character is really grappling with, and I think perhaps because I see him as being a little bit older than some of the other characters in the book, and perhaps a little bit more self-aware than some of the other characters in the book. So I feel like he's really understood some of the things that the other characters are trying to still perhaps figuring out. So Stan, for instance, probably hasn't quite grasped. And I think, what the other characters perhaps know intuitively about time passing or things not working out quite how you like, or time moving on. Paul is much more conscious of, and I think for him, the wedding becomes this kind of moment where great dissonance between his revelation and the behavior of everyone else around him, which I think is a not uncommon experience with people in the world, where you quite often, I mean, especially now, but you can definitely look at the world sometimes and the way you see it and understand it can be in those big events, like, or looking at global events, you can feel a great dissonance between your feeling and the feeling of the world. So I think what he's trying to do throughout that story is, I guess, root himself in something material or something timely. Timing of the story, and I think it's in these quite short, little chunky chapters that give a blow-by-blow account, is maybe an attempt to write himself back into time, to try and hold on to something. And I think to an extent that's also what he's trying to do in his journey home. Crudely, like, plane travel means that a journey that should be, I don't know how many miles it is, but several thousand miles can be done in 4 hours. And I think that sense of untimeliness prompts him to try and say, no, right, well, I'm going to actually navigate this route home. I'm going to cross the land, and I'm going to do it like this.
He gets very concerned by the word contracted. He thinks the world is contracted, which sort of ties in with his impending situation with his wife, perhaps, and, impending pregnancy. But you started off, well, near enough started off the collection with this idea of boom. And then by the end, it's this very specific concern with contraction. And yeah, it's that the idea of writing himself into the world. And he is a bit more artful understanding of the world. And he's trying to sort of write himself. Well, I think it's a really nice way you put it. And I was wondering how you see then your stories fitting into the world.
It's probably quite interesting that the only story that was written specifically for the collection was that one. I think the others had all been written before I started putting it together. Maybe I think there's 2 other exceptions. The heavy lifting stories, if you could call it that, had been written beforehand. And I mean, I'm still learning to write, but this was definitely, I can see myself learning to write when I look at these stories. And also see I think because we spent quite a lot of time talking about what I'm interested in, basically. And I think it's interesting because actually to sort of reflect on the fact that a lot of these stories are me working out what I'm interested in, working out where I want to put my brain and what I want to think about. And
in a writer's sense.
Yeah, definitely. I think I definitely finished writing Stand Standing and thought everything I ever write is going to be like this. And I don't think I've ever quite written anything like that again. I see these kind of stories as kind of as part of just as a real learning process and a real way of me figuring out how to write, and about where do I want to look, what do I want to see, what do I want to explore, what am I interested in. This all sounds quite self-involved, but I think
not all. It's that idea again, that we talked about in Birch a bit. This idea of trying to create a space for yourself and a space for you to kind of learn, perhaps expand as a writer. And I'm not experienced enough to say if that process ever stops, but I don't think it ever would. And the best writers maybe don't let that process ever stop. And it has a very distinct, but that's the thing, at the same time, it has a very distinctive voice and style.
One of my biggest worries actually about it as a collection was that it was way too short. I never looked at it, and I thought, I remember Dan, the editor, showed it to me, and I said, Dan, this is far too short. We have to put some more stories on. He did a really good job of convincing me it would be fine. I mean, it's quite short. I guess maybe with a bit of reflection and hindsight, I think actually because those stories are doing quite a lot of work in terms of working out what they're interested in, contain quite a lot. I don't know whether other writers do this, but definitely one of my techniques of writing a story is to sort of to stop it getting too long, is to try and give myself some quite clear boundaries. You'll notice quite a lot of the stories have these quite bounded moments. Stand Standing would be one example. I mean, he never leaves this hall. So in earlier drafts of Stand Standing, he'd kind of gone outside of the house. He'd gone to the park, he'd gone to the shop, he'd gone, as I was trying to work out how to write it, it and became compressed and compressed and compressed, and until he was just in the hall. And I guess Above the Fat would be another one where I think by that point I learned a little bit more about how I work. So I deliberately sort of set myself the challenge of writing the story just about in the time it took him to cook the egg, as a way of kind of creating the constraint. So I guess I can see, looking at these stories, I can see myself learning. I can see myself figuring out how to construct, how to write, find things I want to write about, and how to find a way in which to write them.
Well, I was going to go on to Above the Fat, and I think it's really interesting that, how did you say it? How you found out about the way you want to write. Yeah, it's interesting that Above the Fat is not reducing it to a kind of metaphysical thing at all, because it's not, but it's kind of represents two different ways of approaching a task, perhaps. It's a story about a chef, the relationship with his father, and what you get is between descriptions of the chef meticulously frying this egg, you jump between interactions with his father, and the chef has very sort of specific ideas about food and how it should be served and how it should be cooked, and which is because that's the way he's learned. But then his father lives in relative kind of mess, and I don't know if the word you describe it would be revolting, But to me, as a reader, perhaps I'm a bit squeamish, but compared to the kind of meticulous egg frying moments, we see the father drinking soup out of a can and there's bits of it caught in his beard. And I wondered where you situate yourself with these characters. Do you empathise with the chef's position? Do you empathise with the father's more?
I think that's actually kind of got to the center of one of the things that I was trying to do with the story, and it actually came up when we were editing the story because the editor suggested that maybe a couple of word choices that would have given us slightly more, given the sense that it was some of the food that was discussed, because in the story the regulars at the pub, one of the narratives is that the chef cooks all this like very pure and like objectively good food, and the regulars don't want it. They want
Anyway, burgers and lamb chops, but
yeah, and ice cream.
Yeah,
just pub food. And I think there was this suggestion that we change a word that would suggest that this was actually the story was also sharing the chef's perspective. And I go back on it because for me it was quite important that the chef has this idea of what food is objectively, but the story shouldn't, and that the story itself should be a bit more open and let that be the chef's perspective. I was interested in this idea of the sense of better objectivity, basically, and whether or not there is an objective point at which we can say this is good, this is a nice dish of food, this is a bad one, this is a bad dish of food. And I think it becomes poignant in the story because for a large amount of the chef's life, the thing that he has with his father is this shared connection. And then the point at which that connection disappears because of his father's health, I guess, starting of his dementia, he finds that shared bit has ruptured. So his kind of measurement on the world, his understanding of what is objectively good and bad is suddenly shattered. And we were talking earlier about kind of lineages and heritage and things you get. And I think for him in that story, it's the thing that he is unable to cope with is the idea that his kind of yardstick on how things fit together, which for him is this understanding that this is how you cook a steak, this is how you cook an egg, ruptures. And then he doesn't really know how to cope with that. And then the story is based around the idea that the one thing that he can still have this crossover is the egg.
You don't say that he's got dementia. You kind of
no, it's not stated.
And what there is like you said, a lot of ideas of lineage. There's also a lot of byproducts. I thought, what are the byproducts of perhaps this relationship? Byproducts of his cooking, like I said, the lamb bones, the pink meat. The patrons of the pub don't like pink meat. They don't like lamb bones. And I wondered if maybe there is something in what we've talked about in this idea of process and fitting things together. And it's not always the things that we do consciously, like the chef and his frying his egg. I don't know whether or not it is always the things that we can do consciously that can, bring things together, or whether we can always live with a sense of things connecting or not.
People can be quite disturbed by seeing this waste, this excess, or these byproducts that they didn't associate with what they were trying to do. They wanted the actual product, the lamb. They didn't want to be reminded that there are consequences and that their desire for this one thing is going to have consequences for other parts of the world, other people, other points of meat.
Bill Mathers is one of the short stories, and it's about a fictional deceased writer who's left a series of notes on other famous writers and people. And the story itself is about a man documenting this dead writer, potentially trying to find his own tools to write, and maybe not finding them, and maybe not being able to put things together. I was just wondered what Mathers might represent and what the relationship with Mathers might represent.
The name Bill Mathers is stolen from a Flann O'Brien novel, the character in The Third Policeman, I think. It was definitely a process of me. It started trying to do one thing, and then the story kind of diverted, and then I kind of repurposed it as a story. I think I guess that's maybe, I'm still, still working on things now. I'm always trying to, things never quite turn out how you intend them to. But that's not necessarily a bad thing.
But yeah, things don't always turn out how you intended, but that's not the worst thing that happens. Book and your stories are a testament to that. And I think it's a very wholesome way of looking at not just writing, but life as well. And I think, that's what I certainly took from it. And
oh, that's great.
Which, gives a really nice sense of wholesomeness.
You can buy Thomas's short story collection Above the That from Splice's website. You can find me on Twitter if you like, at Liam H. Bishop, and you can also join me next time when I'll be speaking to the poet Catherine Horrocks about her debut collection of poetry, Growlery, which has just been published by Carcanet. Until next time.